In this video, I want to talk a little bit about a philosopher that I've been reading, and particularly an idea of his that I think is very important. The philosopher's name is Chuang Tzu, and the philosophy that he's talking about is perspectivism. So Chuang Tzu was a Taoist philosopher in about maybe the 4th century. Scholars don't really know a whole lot about him. We do believe that he was a real person. And those who aren't familiar with Taoism may know of the book, the Tao Te Ching, which is kind of the foundational text of the Taoist philosophy and religion. So Chuang Tzu wrote about maybe a century or so after Lao Tzu wrote the Tao Te Ching. And the philosophy that I'm going to be looking at today is part of Chuang Tzu's Taoist philosophy. It's called Perspectivism. And it's the idea that there are basically just a variety of perspectives in the world, none of which can claim to be anything more than a perspective, even though, ironically, all viewpoints want to claim that they're more than a perspective. And I think this idea has something to say to us today. So let's walk through what that is. So to understand Chuang Tzu's perspectivism, let's start with a quote of his. It says, "Suppose you and I get into a debate. If you win and I lose, does that really mean you are right and I'm wrong? If I win and you lose, does that really mean I'm right and you're wrong? Must one of us be right and the other wrong, or could both of us be right or both of us wrong? If neither you or I can know, a third person would be even more benighted. Whom should we have straighten out the matter? Someone who agrees with you? Well, since he already agrees with you, how can he straighten it out? Someone who agrees with me? Well, since she already agrees with me, how can she straighten it out? Someone who disagrees with both of us? But if he already disagrees with both of us, how can he straighten it out? Etc., etc., etc." So this is probably the best example of what Chuang Tzu seems to want to claim, because he really never makes a direct argument in his work. That really the world in some sense reduces to a bunch of perspectives, that we all want to claim that our perspective is right, and obviously if we hold a particular view, we all think that our view is right. And what Chuang Tzu wants to say is that your view is less right from any objective viewpoint, because we can't have an objective neutral viewpoint. Your view is probably right from your standards, let's say, of reasoning, argument, persuasion that you're using, but another person's argument is going to be equally persuasive to their standards of reasoning, evidence, their viewpoint. It's a really frustrating view to take, because when we're in an argument, we all kind of imagine that what we're doing is what philosopher William James likes to say. We make what he says is an assumption which ordinary men follow when they're disputing one another about questions of good and bad. They imagine an abstract moral order in which the objective truth resides, and each tries to prove that that pre-existing order is more accurately reflected in his own ideas than those of his adversaries. So imagine this argument, right? Two people arguing over this number. So this is a really basic argument. So what's probably going on is one of them from their perspective sees the 6, the other one from their perspective sees a 9. And let's just suppose that neither of these people knows that if you turn around, you'll see the other's number. They're convinced that this is the only way to see this number. So what they're probably going to do is say, well, I'm right. And if this other person would just, listen to reason, the reason that I think is clearly convincing, they would agree with me. And then the other person is doing the same thing. Moreover, to William James's point, we're probably also imagining that if a neutral observer were to come in and listen to this argument, surely they would agree with me. And then the other person is thinking the same thing. But all we're doing is imagining from our own perspective, someone coming in who probably would agree with our perspective, coming in and being convinced by our arguments. So going back to the Chuang Tzu quote also, it's important to realize that let's say that I convince you that I'm right. That doesn't necessarily mean that I'm right in any objective neutral sense. It just means that I've convinced you. And the same thing if you've convinced me. Chuang Tzu also mentions the possibility that both of us could be right. And this is kind of another interesting consequence of his perspectivism. It could be that the best we can say is, from my perspective, these arguments make sense. From your perspective, those arguments make sense. We're using in some ways maybe different standards of reasoning. I might find one argument convincing and you might find it unconvincing. But whether I find it convincing is a value judgment that I make from my perspective. And whether you find it unconvincing is a value judgment you make from another perspective. All right, so the critic is going to say, well, okay, this sounds like Chuang Tzu is arguing that there's really no such thing as the external world, that it's all perspective, that it's some sort of what philosophers would call idealism. There's no world out there physically. It all emanates from a mind or a perspective or a consciousness. And that's not really the Taoist view. So let's just get into Taoist metaphysics just a little bit. For the Taoist, the problem is that there is a world, what they call a Tao, which is a way, the totality of everything that happens, that pretty clearly exists out there. And we have every reason to think that there's this world that exists independently of us. The problem comes when humans try to look at it, think about it, and use words to describe it. Because even when we start looking at things, we start making distinctions that to the Taoist don't exist in the world themselves. So if I say that's a tree, that's a flower, and the tree and the flower are separate, to the Taoist, that's going to be like, what I'm doing is looking at this tree as this isolated thing and looking at a flower as an isolated thing. And maybe the tree is part of a class of trees, so I create the concept tree. For the Taoist, those concepts don't exist in nature, we create them. And they're not saying that making those concepts are bad. Certainly thinking, you need concepts to think, but that's the problem. Whenever we look at the world and think about the world and use language to describe the world, we're making judgments that aren't really in nature. They're kind of a human way to make sense of things. So we can't really get to the world as it is, unmediated by experience. That's why Chuang Tzu says, now, courses, by which he means the way, have never had any sealed borders between them, and words have never had any sustainability. It's by establishing definitions of what is this, what is right, that boundaries are made. So he's saying the world itself has no boundaries. The world itself has no things, if by thing we mean tree, flower. The world has this stuff. It's just this stuff. It is. As soon as we start to say anything about it, we are establishing categories. And again, there's nothing wrong with establishing categories. It just can't get us to the world as it actually is. So that's the Taoist metaphysics, if you want to call it a metaphysics, that I think will help us understand perspectivism a little bit. So this brings us to what for many people is a really, really perplexing quote by Chuang Tzu. And Chuang Tzu is not an easy writer to read. He almost delights in these really playful sentences that are really hard to make sense of, not because they're cumbersome, but because they're almost paradoxical. But here's the quote, and I think we can understand it using what we've just thought about. Chuang Tzu says, there is no being that is not that. There is no being that is not this. But one cannot be seeing these from the perspective of that. One only knows them from this, from one's own perspective. Thus, we can say that emerges from this, and this follows from that. This is the theory of simultaneous generation of this and that. And that's only part of the quote. It goes on. So you can see it's a pretty hard quote to read unless you really understand what Chuang Tzu is trying to say. So looking back at the 6 and the 9, we can think of it like this. For the person who looks at the 6, they're thinking like this is the way it is. This being the 6 that I see in front of me. And for the person who sees the 9, the view that 6 is what's in front of you is that perspective. This perspective for the 9 is the 9 that's in front of me. And the only way that it makes sense to say this is a 6 is if it could be otherwise than a 6. If it were just transparently obvious to everyone that it's 6, we wouldn't even talk about it. It wouldn't even be something we could dispute. So the very idea of saying this is this presupposes that someone else could see what you see as this, as that. Another example would be, I have a computer in front of me, and I can say this is my computer. So for my worldview, the computer is this. But for a student of mine who doesn't have this computer, and they come into my office and they see the computer, my this is their that. That is Dr. Currie-Knight's computer, whereas for me, this is my computer. We can also extend this into the world of ideas. So I just picked an idea that is kind of under some debate currently in the blogosphere and stuff like that. Let's just take this idea, feminism. Although you could take any idea at all. Feminism for some people is a this. This is the perspective that I find conducive to my worldview. But for other people, let's say anti-feminists, feminism is a that. Feminism is the viewpoint that is the antithesis of my own. And then, of course, for the feminist, anti-feminism is that, whereas for the anti-feminist, it's this. So the idea is that every viewpoint is in some sense a response to a response to how it could be differently. So if I value feminism, the reason I value feminism is because we live in a world where the opposite of feminism is either possible or actual, where women have experienced the sorts of oppression that feminism was kind of created to fight. So even feminism, by establishing the idea of feminism, you're saying that feminism in some ways depends on its opposite to exist. You could say the same about anti-feminism, which is probably more obvious. Anti-feminism is a view that was spawned by a world where feminism is possible and actual. So anti-feminism depends on feminism to exist. So for the Taoist, kind of the world of concepts and the world of perspectives almost entails that every perspective will have its opposite somewhere that it in some way depends on. So why is this important to think about? This is a fairly relativistic philosophy, and I know relativism isn't fancy these days, isn't really seen in a very friendly way. So I think there's a few reasons why this view is particularly important. So the Taoists have this symbol, I'm sure you've seen it, it's the Yin and Yang symbol. So in this symbol, depending on how you look at it, the Yin and Yang are constantly in motion, they're pushing on each other. Or they're constantly staying still and trying to push on each other. And each one stays still because the other is pushing with the same amount of pressure so that they reach a standstill. So I think if we look at Zhuangzi's perspectivism a certain way, we can see that in some sense, we might appreciate that views in some ways depend on their opposites to exist. And my view pushes on your view pushes on my view. And in some ways, the Taoists say that's the only way the world can grow. So let's take language, for instance. I think language is a great example of this. So there's a conservative and a liberal tendency in language. Language both changes, and there are people who kind of fight for language to change to fit the times. Language also has this really conservative impulse. If language changed too fast, no one could actually speak because words would mean something totally different tomorrow than today. And language, for its growth, depends on both of those to fight each other. If the liberals won out, language would change all the time and we just couldn't speak. If the conservatives won out, language would never change, and the same language that we have today, we would have to use, language from prehistoric times to fit circumstances of today, and language would also become unspeakable. It's only through the interplay of all these ideas that we kind of push each other. I guess you could think about it in a Western idea of maybe a dialectic. So the second reason I think that this is a really important view is I think what Zhuangzi had in mind is he thought that the best way to live was that of the sage. And the sage in some ways puts themselves over top of the perspectives by recognizing that all of the perspectives exist, and also by recognizing that their perspective is a perspective. It's just one of many possible. So Zhuangzi says whenever a division is made, something is left undivided. Wherever debate shows one of two alternatives to be right, something remains undistinguished and unshown. What is it? The sage hides it in his embrace while the masses of people debate it, trying to demonstrate it to one another. So the idea of the sage is kind of someone who is able to sit over top of everything. Compare this to the debates that we have in social media spaces. I'm sure you've had discussions, as I have, where you're convinced that you have the truth, and if the other person just listened to what you think are these obviously reasonable arguments, they would absolutely be convinced, and you're tearing your hair out because you can't understand why this other person doesn't find your arguments persuasive. And you know what? They're doing the same thing on their side. They're saying, wow, this person over here is not listening to these obvious reasons, and they're giving me these horrible reasons, and they think they're so good. Why is that? I think if we take a Zhuangzi sage perspective on this, we could at least kind of ease some of that tension. We all want to believe that our perspective is the one that's correct, obviously, because our perspective is the only one we have access to. But if you think from a sage perspective, a Zhuangzi perspective, you can look and say, well, why is it that this person wouldn't find this argument convincing? When I say the argument is convincing, I feel like it's the argument that's convincing, but maybe it's my ears hearing the argument that's convincing. So maybe what is convincing to me isn't convincing to them. Let me figure out why it might not be convincing to them. And I think Zhuangzi's recommendation is that the only way you can convince someone who only has a perspective that's just like your perspective is by changing their perspective, by getting your perspective somehow to fit into their perspective. So it's not that you are obviously right and they're just not listening to reason, or they're obviously right and you're not listening to reason. It's that maybe neither of you is trying hard enough simply to persuade the other on their terms from their perspective. So I think Zhuangzi's arguments, although written in the 4th century, have some real guidance that they can give us today.